The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden platform of Timber Creek Station as the train pulled away in a cloud of steam and dust. Victoria Hayes stood alone on the worn planks, her worn leather suitcase at her feet, watching the locomotive disappear into the distance like her last connection to everything familiar. She was 24 years old, a mail-order bride traveling over 1,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met. A man who knew nothing about her except what she'd written in 3 carefully composed letters over the past 2 months. Victoria looked down at herself and felt a wave of shame wash over her. Her pale dress was wrinkled and stained from 3 days of travel. Her dark hair, which she'd tried so hard to keep neat, had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. And worst of all, her shoes were torn beyond repair. The leather split along the seams, her stockings visible through the gaps. She'd tried to hide them during the journey, tucking her feet beneath her skirts. But now there was no hiding anything. She was about to meet the man who'd paid for her passage, who expected a proper bride. And she looked like a ragamuffin who'd been dragged behind the train rather than riding in it. The other passengers from her car had already been collected by waiting family members, or had headed toward the town's small hotel. Victoria stood alone, anxiety twisting in her stomach. What if he took one look at her and changed his mind? What if he demanded his money back and sent her away? She had exactly $4.37 to her name. Not enough to get home, even if home was a place she could return to. Home was a burned-out farmhouse in Missouri, where her parents and younger brother had died of fever 6 months ago. Home was the cousin who'd taken her in reluctantly and made it clear she was a burden. Home was the slow starvation of charity and pity until she'd seen the advertisement in the newspaper, rancher seeking wife. Must be of good character and willing to work. Passage provided. She'd written that first letter in desperation and received a reply from Garrett Morrison of Timber Creek, Wyoming. His letters had been brief but kind, practical without being cold. He needed a partner to help run his ranch. She needed a fresh start and a place to belong. It seemed like a fair arrangement, but arrangements required both parties to hold up their end, and Victoria worried she was failing before she'd even begun. Miss Hayes? The voice was deep and steady, and Victoria turned to see a man approaching from the far end of the platform. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his early 30s with a brown hat tipped back on his head and a vest over his work shirt. His face was handsome in a weathered, lived-in way, with dark eyes that studied her carefully. This had to be Garrett Morrison. Victoria's heart hammered as he drew closer. She could see him taking in her disheveled appearance, her stained dress, her wild hair. His gaze traveled downward and stopped at her feet. She wanted to sink through the platform boards and disappear. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know I must look terrible. There was a problem on the train. A man spilled coffee and my shoes. They were already old, and the journey was so long. And I tried to make myself presentable, but everything went wrong. And I understand if you've changed your mind. I can find work in town. I won't hold you to the arrangement. I know this isn't what you expected." "Miss Hayes," Garrett interrupted gently. "Take a breath." Victoria stopped, her chest heaving with emotion and exhaustion. She forced herself to meet his eyes, expecting to see disappointment or disgust. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like understanding. Garrett stepped closer and looked down at her ruined shoes again. Then he looked back up at her face, and slowly a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Then you've brought everything that matters," he said. Victoria blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "Your shoes," Garrett said, gesturing to her torn footwear. "They tell me you've traveled a long way to get here, that you've walked through hard times and kept going anyway, that you're not some pampered city girl who'll run at the first sign of difficulty." He picked up her suitcase. "Worn-out shoes and a willingness to keep walking. That's exactly what this life requires." Victoria stared at him, tears suddenly burning in her eyes. She'd been preparing herself for rejection, for judgment, for the confirmation that she wasn't good enough. Instead, this man she'd never met was looking at her most obvious failure and finding value in it. "I don't have anything fancy," she managed to say. "No fine dresses or jewelry. Everything in that suitcase is old and mended. I'm not what you probably pictured when you placed that advertisement. Garrett tilted his head, considering her. Do you know what I pictured when I wrote that advertisement? Victoria shook her head. I pictured someone real, he said. Someone who understood that life out here isn't easy or glamorous. Someone who wouldn't expect me to be something I'm not. I'm a rancher, Miss Hayes. I work from sunup to sundown. I come home dirty and tired. My house is simple. My life is simple. The last thing I need is someone who expects romance and luxury. He shifted the suitcase to his other hand and offered her his arm. What I need is a partner, he continued. Someone willing to work beside me to build something together. Your letters told me you were practical and honest. Your appearance tells me you're resilient and not afraid of hardship. Those are the things that matter. Victoria took his arm hesitantly, still not quite believing this was happening. You're not disappointed? Not even a little, Garrett said firmly. Though I am concerned about those shoes. We'll stop at the general store on our way out of town and get you something sturdy. Can't have my wife walking around with her toes showing. Wife? The word sent a jolt through Victoria. They were supposed to be married this evening by the circuit judge who happened to be in Timber Creek. She'd been so worried about making a good first impression that she hadn't fully processed the reality of what was about to happen. They walked together down the dusty main street, Victoria acutely aware of people watching them pass. She must have been quite a sight, bedraggled and beaten down, walking beside this confident, capable man. But Garrett didn't seem to notice or care what anyone thought. He walked with his head high, treating her with the same courtesy he would have shown the finest lady. At the general store, he spoke with the shopkeeper about sturdy boots for working, not dainty slippers for show. He picked out 2 pairs, one for every day and one for Sunday, and added thick stockings and a practical work dress to the pile. You don't have to, Victoria protested as the costs added up. The shoes are enough. You'll need proper clothing for ranch work, Garrett said practically. Consider it an investment in our partnership. He paid without hesitation, then handed her the packages. There's a room in back where you can change if you'd like. We have about an hour before we're due at the judge's house. Victoria accepted the packages gratefully and hurried to the back room. She changed into the new dress and boots, running her fingers through her hair and pinning it back as neatly as she could manage. The new clothes made her feel more human, more worthy of what was about to happen. When she emerged, Garrett nodded with approval. Better? Much better, Victoria said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Garrett said with a slight smile. You haven't seen the ranch or met the reality of what you're agreeing to. They walked to the judge's house at the edge of town, a neat little cottage with flowers in the window boxes. Judge Harrington was an elderly man with kind eyes who asked them both if they were entering this marriage of their own free will. I am, Garrett said firmly. Victoria took a breath and met Garrett's gaze. She saw steadiness there, honesty, and something that might have been hope. This man had seen her at her worst and hadn't turned away. He'd seen her failures and called them strengths. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. I am, she said. The ceremony was brief and practical, much like everything else about Garrett Morrison. They exchanged simple vows, and the judge pronounced them husband and wife. Garrett shook the judge's hand, thanked him for his time, and then turned to Victoria. Ready to see your new home? He asked. Victoria nodded, and they walked to where Garrett's wagon waited. He helped her up onto the seat with gentle courtesy, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they left Timber Creek behind, heading into the open country beyond, Victoria watched the landscape transform around them. Rolling hills covered in prairie grass, stands of pine trees, mountains rising in the distance. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that was nothing like the gentle farmland she'd grown up with. It's about an hour's drive, Garrett said. Give or take. I hope you don't mind the quiet. I don't mind, Victoria said, and she meant it. After the noise and crowds of the train, the peaceful silence was a relief. They rode in comfortable quiet for a while, and then Garrett began to talk. He told her about the ranch, how he'd homesteaded the land 7 years ago and built it up from nothing. How he ran cattle and grew hay, how the work was hard but satisfying. how he'd always imagined having a family to share it with someday. "I was married before," he said, and Victoria heard the careful control in his voice. "Rachel, she died 3 years ago. Pneumonia. We'd only been married a year." "I'm sorry," Victoria said softly. "So am I," Garrett replied. "I swore after that I'd never marry again. The pain of losing her was too much. But time passes and a man gets lonely. Not just for companionship, but for partnership. For someone to build a life with." He glanced at her. "I want you to know that I don't expect you to replace Rachel or be anyone but yourself. This is a fresh start for both of us. Whatever we build together will be ours, not a recreation of something that came before." Victoria appreciated his honesty more than she could say. "I understand. And I promise I'll work hard and do my best to be a good partner." "That's all I ask," Garrett said. The ranch appeared gradually as they crested a hill. A sturdy house made of logs and stone, a large barn, several outbuildings, and acres of fenced pasture where cattle grazed. It was neat and well-maintained, clearly the work of someone who took pride in what they'd built. "It's beautiful," Victoria said, and she meant it. "It's home," Garrett said simply. He helped her down from the wagon and showed her around. The house had 3 rooms, a main room with a kitchen area and fireplace, and 2 smaller bedrooms. It was simple but clean, functional without being sparse. "That one's mine," Garrett said, pointing to one bedroom. "This one's yours. I figure we can take things slow, get to know each other properly before we make any decisions about, well, about how we want to arrange things." Victoria felt a rush of gratitude and relief. "Thank you for understanding." "We're partners," Garrett said. Partners respect each other's boundaries and comfort levels. Over the following weeks, they settled into a rhythm. Victoria learned the routines of ranch life, feeding chickens, tending the garden, cooking meals, mending clothes and equipment. Garrett taught her patiently, never making her feel foolish when she made mistakes. In return, Victoria brought organization to the household. She cleaned and arranged, planted herbs and flowers, created a home rather than just a dwelling. She learned to cook the hearty meals Garrett needed after long days of hard work. And she found satisfaction in seeing him enjoy her efforts. They talked in the evenings, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future. Victoria learned that Garrett was thoughtful and kind, with a dry sense of humor that surprised her. He learned that Victoria was intelligent and resourceful, quick to learn and not afraid of hard work. And slowly, carefully, affection grew between them. It started with small things, Garrett bringing her wildflowers from the meadow, Victoria mending his favorite shirt with particular care, the way they'd catch each other's eyes across the room and smile, how they began sitting closer together on the porch in the evenings, until eventually Victoria was comfortable leaning against his shoulder. 3 months after their wedding, on a warm summer evening, Victoria was washing dishes when Garrett came up behind her and gently turned her to face him. "I have something for you," he said. He held out a small box, and when Victoria opened it, she found a pair of earrings inside. Nothing fancy, just simple silver hoops, but clearly chosen with care. "They're beautiful," Victoria said, touched. "I wanted to give you something nice," Garrett said, "to thank you for everything you've done to make this place a home, and to tell you that somewhere along the way, this arrangement stopped being just an arrangement for me." Victoria's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've fallen in love with you," Garrett said simply. "Not because you're my wife on paper, but because of who you are. Your strength, your kindness, your laughter, the way you sing while you work and how you talk to the chickens like they're your friends. I love all of it. I love you." Tears filled Victoria's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling that first day when you looked at my torn shoes and said I'd brought everything that matters." Garrett smiled and pulled her close. "You did bring everything that matters. You brought yourself. That was always enough." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Victoria felt like she'd finally come home. Not to a place, but to a person. To a partnership built on respect and understanding that had grown into something deeper and more beautiful than she'd ever imagined possible. That night, Victoria moved her belongings into Garrett's room, and they became husband and wife in truth, not just in name. It was tender and loving, the natural progression of the affection they'd been building for months. The years that followed were good ones. They worked side by side, building the ranch into something prosperous and successful. They weathered hard winters and dry summers, difficult calvings and market downturns, facing every challenge together. They had 3 children, 2 sons who grew up loving the ranch as much as their father did, and a daughter who had her mother's determination and her father's steady nature. And every year on their anniversary, Garrett would give Victoria a new pair of shoes, not because she needed them, but as a reminder of how they'd started. Sturdy, practical shoes for a strong, practical woman who'd traveled far and overcome much to build a life worth living. Victoria kept the torn shoes from that first day wrapped in cloth in her trunk. Sometimes she'd take them out and remember the frightened young woman who'd stood on that platform, certain she wasn't good enough, and she'd think about the man who'd seen past the surface to the substance beneath, who'd valued resilience over appearance, strength over pretense, honesty over perfection. When Garrett was 60 and Victoria 52, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Their children were grown with families of their own, visiting often but living their own lives. The ranch was thriving, a testament to decades of hard work and partnership. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked, leaning against Garrett's shoulder in the way that had become natural over 30 years together. "Marrying a stranger who showed up in torn shoes?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, then he laughed softly. "Not once. Those torn shoes were the best thing that ever happened to me." "How do you figure?" Victoria asked, smiling. "Because they told me everything I needed to know," Garrett said. "That you were real and honest. That you'd been through hard times and survived them. That you were willing to walk a difficult path if it led somewhere worth going." He turned to look at her, his eyes still holding the warmth they'd held on that first day. "You arrived with torn shoes and became my whole world." "I'd say that worked out pretty well." Victoria kissed him softly. "I'd say it worked out perfectly." Their love story became legendary in Timber Creek, the bride with torn shoes and the rancher who saw past them. It was told to children and grandchildren as an example of looking deeper than surface appearances, of valuing substance over style, of understanding that sometimes the most beautiful things come in worn packaging. And every young person in town who ever felt like they weren't good enough, weren't pretty enough, weren't worthy enough, heard the story and took hope from it. Because if a girl with torn shoes could find true love and build a beautiful life, then maybe, just maybe, they could too. Victoria and Garrett lived into their 80s, side by side until the end. When Victoria passed first, Garrett placed her wedding ring and a pair of those first sturdy boots he'd bought her into her casket. The boots that had carried her into a new life, into a partnership that became love, into a home she'd built with her own 2 hands and a man who'd seen her worth from the very beginning. And when Garrett followed 2 years later, their children buried him next to her, together forever as they'd been in life. On the headstone, beneath their names and dates, they carved a simple phrase that captured the essence of their love story. She arrived with torn shoes and brought everything that mattered. It was the truth, the only truth that ever really counted. If this story reminded you that true worth isn't found in perfect appearances, but in honest hearts willing to work hard and love deeply, please hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate looking past the surface to find the substance beneath, and that remind us we're all worthy of love exactly as we are. Leave a comment telling us about a time someone saw your worth when you felt worthless, or when you recognized value that others overlooked. Your stories create connection, and we're grateful for everyone. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember that you always bring everything that matters no matter what condition your shoes are in.